we've been through grammarians, encyclopedists, we've been through Augustine, Marcianus Capella, some of the precursors and whatnot. But honestly, when most people think of medieval rhetoric, they think of the three arts. The three arts. This is the heart and soul of medieval rhetoric, and it's what most people think about. But I wanted you to go through that because I wanted you to see how we get to that. And you're really kind of doing medieval rhetoric short shrift unless you talk about some of those other things as well. And you're also doing medieval rhetoric a disservice when you don't realize that whereas during the Middle Ages, rhetoric comes to be embodied within three different arts or pursuits or uses, if you want to look at it that way, or three genres, you can even look at it that way. There is a difference between two eras in the Middle Ages, the Carolingian age, 800 to 1099 roughly. Well, you could say the early Middle Ages, but honestly it comes, you know, well into the early Middle Ages, 800 to 1099, and then the Scholastic movement. So, yes, by the Carolingian age, 800, which is the latter part of that early Middle Ages or Dark Ages period, the three arts are emerging, and you see it in works by Alcuin, Alberic of Monte Cassino, Rabanus Maurus, and those kind of guys. You also see, however, the three arts becoming far more sophisticated after the 1100s with the Scholastic movement. So there are the three arts, yes. There are other things going on in the Middle Ages too. I wanted you to know about that. That's what we just did in the last several slides. There are the three arts in the Middle Ages, but there are the earlier treatments of them, the earlier discussions of them in the Carolingian age, and then there are the treatments and discussions of them in the Scholastic period. So let's talk about the Carolingian age and the three arts. The arts, of course, are the ars dictaminis, which is letter writing, okay? Really what we would lump into pretty much business correspondence is what we would probably call it. The ars predicandi, which is preaching, and the ars poetria. Now, what exemplifies or typifies, I should say, the ars dictaminis is that the parts of the epistle were structured like a speech. It was very formulaic, and so Alcuin, in his Disputatio, it's written in the form of a dialogue between himself and Charlemagne. Of course, that's why we call it the Carolingian period, because Charlemagne, even though he was not literate, crowned on Christmas Day in the year AD 800, ushers in this big boom of scholarly activity. So much to his credit, even though he wasn't a terribly literate guy, he understood and valued the importance of education, and he established schools and brought in some of the finest scholars from all over the early Middle Ages. And really with Charlemagne, you can say that the Dark Ages for sure come to an end. And so Alcuin is doing this sort of fictional dialogue between himself and Charlemagne, largely to flatter Charlemagne, of course, because he couldn't have probably held that kind of conversation. It's a compendium of ideas from Cicero and other people and other sources. It's the first work of the Middle Ages to consider purely secular uses of rhetoric. That is a really interesting thing, because up to this point it's, why should we study rhetoric? Well, it's good for the kingdom of God. It's good to recruit people to Christianity. It's good to convert people. It's good to get them the message across to them, and you want that congregation every Sunday to really get the message you're trying to give them. Here Alcuin is saying, look, there are secular uses for it. There are business purposes, political, business, legal purposes for knowing rhetoric. So there we're kind of going back full circle to the classical period. Cicero would have absolutely identified with that. Alberic of Monte Cassino, it's a fairly lengthy text. I know one of you is going to hold forth on this probably. It's the first systematic treatment of the ars dictaminis, because Alcuin's is really kind of in this form of a dialogue, but this is really a very, very systematic kind of methodical look at all the rules set for different types of correspondences, especially international correspondence. This becomes the handbook on how to write business and legal and political and diplomatic letters from one princely kingdom to another. Okay, it's kind of like a style manual, if you will, of writing official correspondences, and just about everybody would have a copy on his shelf. And when you had to go write an important letter for your boss, this is the format that you would use. It's highly prescriptive. Lots of pagan sources. Alberic seems to be totally unfazed by that. That's just not an issue anymore as to whether you can use pagan sources. Note that in here and say, wow, he just didn't bat an eye at that. This is not something that he's concerned about like maybe Augustine would be several hundred years ago earlier. Claims that there are 4 parts to the letter, the exordium, the narration, the argument, and the conclusion. And if that sounds very familiar, it's a cribbing of and simplification of Cicero. And that's exactly what you see in these kinds of things. But think of Alberic's text as maybe being that thing that every scribe, every clerk who worked for somebody in a big medieval manor had to have access to, because if his boss came to him, Lord so and so, and said, "I need you to write a letter to the king," you better know what format you ought to put it in, right? And Alberic's became kind of the standard sort of Turabian guide or University of Chicago style manual guide to writing that kind of letter. The Ars Predicandi, not as terribly well developed in this particular period. It will be later to a much greater extent. Even though this art probably was the most important one, not a lot of development here from earlier writers. Rabanus Maurus, a student of Alcuin, yet another cribber, proposes a course of study for clerics, and this becomes a major textbook for preachers. So even though the Ars Predicandi was probably the most important art of the early Middle Ages, and even though a lot of things were done with respect to that, there wasn't a lot of sort of inventive stuff beyond maybe some of the earlier guys who were arguing about that. Later, though, in the scholastic area, when we get to Robert of Basefort and these kinds of guys, you're really going to see some serious differences there in terms of how one of these things are put together. In all of these, in fact. The Ars Poetria, very simplistic during this time. We haven't progressed much beyond the grammarian style analysis kind of thing and the style advice in the encyclopedias. So that's the earlier part, the Carolingian age. We'll take a look at the scholastic period next.